Today, in fact, I am intending to cover a lot of material. And the only way I know how to do that is to go with the flow. So I intended to have better notes for how to capture everything today. And the nature of the material is that it's all connected. And so it's hard to piece out a specific flow when it's all connected. This doesn't go linearly. But we're just going to have to see how it goes today. That's my disclaimer. Let's see, where are we in time right now? It's February 4th. Black History Month has started. I'm wearing the shirt, "Knowledge is Power," and I feel like that's a phrase that a lot of people know. We've heard it, and I believe it's true. If you read any of Michel Foucault's work, then you would know that knowledge is literally power. And power knowledge work in pretty specific ways. I'm not going to get into that exactly, even though I am intending to do a lot on epistemology today. If you know me or you know my work, then you know that so much of what I do is actually grounded in epistemology, the study of knowledge. And I'm just going to say it, that my background, the reason why I got into philosophy and into theory is coming from a feminist epistemological perspective. Feminist epistemology opened up entirely new ways of thinking about knowing, what we know, how we know stuff, why we know what we know. And that feminist epistemology was sort of supplemented or complemented by other ways of knowing too. So while it was a lot of feminist work, I was also very early on introduced to non-Western and indigenous ways of knowing. And the critiques of knowledge, you could say it's sort of meta philosophical to be thinking about how we know what we know. No surprises there either. But the study of epistemology itself is really in a very critical sort of, in my tradition, my education and training, feminist way of thinking that is inherently political because it is self-reflexive. So there's a way of thinking about meta practices of asking the questions about the discipline itself. This is actually coming from probably one of the most influential roots of my work too, deeply influenced by a specific person who I will always talk about, David Dean. And David Dean was the one who really challenged me by taking me seriously and allowing me to take philosophical questions very seriously. And I've alluded to this, I've written about it in other places. Like I said, I'll always keep talking about it, but it was in David's class when I was a junior in college. So 20 years old. And he started helping me understand how to think very critically about the discipline of philosophy itself and ask questions about who is allowed to be the philosopher, who is legitimate in the discipline, what kind of approaches to theory or writing, even knowing, are actually deemed credible and then reified by the institutions that validate who is a philosopher and what counts as doing philosophy. So the key major questions that I got from David Dean at 20 years old that sort of set me on this path for multiple decades now are questions like, who is the philosopher? What is philosophy? What does the philosopher do? And what is philosophy to do? So those are meta-reflective questions on philosophy, sort of philosophical questions about philosophy itself. And honestly, it sort of sets the stage for everything that becomes critical of ways of knowing. So already I'm not where I thought I was going to be. That's okay. Just helpful context, perhaps. But let's see. Very shortly after that, I was introduced to other ways of knowing, well, I mean, let me just say, as soon as you start to engage in questions about how we know what we know with an open mind and an awareness of power and politics always being at play, um, that is a matter of like certain people get to decide what counts as real knowledge, and certain processes and standards of evaluation are put in place to grant credibility and like epistemic authority. Who are the credible knowers? I'm not saying that that's not relevant. I will always say that there is room for um, judging sort of the quality and the value of what we know and who claims to know it. However, that requires a different kind of perspective that is also very conscious of the political context and values that we hold. So I come from a place where my values are rooted in bigger pictures of justice and liberation and freedom. In with that is a lot of love and sustainability and connection to the land and planet and life, like very life affirming frameworks. So that's just a cursory overview of some things. But depending on how we situate ourselves in a background of values and assumptions, that is what ultimately gives us the lens to evaluate knowledge claims and credible knowers. So, all of this you're going to see if you aren't already like hearing it. I mean, it's not so beyond a lot of like common sensibilities, but all of this is deeply implicated in everything that we know and can very quickly become corrupt or inverted in terms of our values. So if your values are those of love and liberation and justice and freedom and sustainability and life, well, there can be many, many opportunities within any structure and system where politics and power flip that so that the ways that we talk about knowledge are actually serving other ends, like you could say capitalism, fascism, violence and domination, and like the destruction of life ultimately. That's why, no matter what, I think the value of being reflective, theoretical, you might even say philosophical, is to always ground us in our values, because the values, I think, become the strongest and most reliable anchor that we have available to us to be able to navigate what can quickly become a very confusing and sometimes intentionally confused or muddy landscape. Not just of what we know, but then everything that grows out of what we know, which includes who we are, who we think we are, how we relate to each other, and then the projects we pursue, the worlds that we build, and even the ways that we start to interrogate and navigate like literally everything in life. So there's becomes this, you can probably hear it, a sort of reflexive cycle where what we think we know informs how we move through the world, and what we do in terms of the world actually builds and creates the world too. So, man, are we confused already? It's getting complicated. Welcome to philosophy, the interrogation of our knowledges. Okay. I feel like I have to also just put a disclaimer out right now too, since we're like early on in all of this, and say that there's no way right now that I'm going to say things perfectly or comprehensively. And maybe that's just like for my own sense of, I don't know, security. It's not to be like a cop out or shirking any accountability or responsibility. It's just that like I'm doing this live on purpose. This isn't a well-formed essay. I'm not delivering an argument, and you could criticize me for that, to say this is maybe a little bit foolish or reckless or careless at the very least. And I can hear that. However, I also think that there's something important about being like authentic and organic in the process too. So I'm doing this on purpose, and with that, I want to just make it obvious and that I know that like I'm not speaking and totalizing 100% claims that are going to be perfect or comprehensive in the way of delivering this. There's just no way to do that. So even let me give you an example. A couple weeks ago, I was talking about heated rivalry and social media and how we can like influence the algorithm and like go down certain rabbit holes, and the fandom of heated rivalry is doing so much work. I'm going to return back to that. And I also want to say that, like, obviously, I was like, well, do I have to be like super explicit that these algorithms are owned by tech billionaires that are, um, influencing so much else in the realities that we live in? And we know that, like, it's not great for our brains and our mental health, or even our perceptions of reality to be just so sucked into social media. So let that be, I think that's like we're going on 2 examples now already, where I'm trying to at least acknowledge with some conscientiousness that there are fine lines here, and we can quickly flip-flop into, like, good and bad, to be as reductive as possible. Good and bad elements of the truth and the realities that we're navigating. So, yes, everything's more complicated, everything's more sophisticated. Yeah, that's true. I'm okay with that. So, I just have to say that, like, as we move through this, I don't want to be so unruly that I have to account for every possible edge, and facet of something that might be a little bit more, nuanced. But that's our responsibility. That's literally what critically thinking is about. That's what trying to learn and decipher and understand the world is asking us to do. One might even say that is the point of thinking and knowledge. So, let's do this little meta moment here and right now to say all of my disclaimers that I just offered are really a kind of a plea to say or to demonstrate. It's a like a meta plea to demonstrate that we cannot become so reliant on having people just spoon feed us something that we accept and internalize as true if we want to be thinking and knowing beings that can really make it in the world. Okay? That's not to say that we can't criticize or hold certain expectations. Like, please do your thoughtful research or have a fairly well formed point of view before sharing it. There's like an element of responsibility there. We can't just be like out here spouting off if we're not rooted in some kind of more disciplined practice of thinking and understanding before we share. I agree with that too. But we can't just take everything and think that that means we know it because somebody else said it without kind of rounding out the edges. There's this phrase, I don't know how many times I've said this on these lives, that I've been thinking about as I'm kind of moving through the development of an epistemology of intimacy and a cornerstone of that epistemology, which is that truth is a relationship. One thing that I've been kind of sitting with, did I just lose it? That's embarrassing. That might come back to me. Hmm. Oh, no, the phrase. There we go. Wow. Look, it's live. It's unpolished. Here we are, organic and raw. But the phrase that I've been saying to think about how to understand the epistemology of intimacy and truth as a relationship is really captured in this like kind of motto that just because you heard it doesn't mean you learned it. And just because you heard it doesn't mean you learned it is really trying to signal like attention going to our own understanding of how do we learn things? Now, this is an old refrain. I say this all the time. What does learning feel like? How do we know that we're learning? And one might even say, like, when do we get to a place of like understanding or knowledge? So epistemological categories you might think here is like thinking, reflecting, learning, understanding, knowing, wisdom. Like there's lots of different elements if we were to just stay in this little sphere of knowledge. And there are differences in how we might like define or demarcate those different qualities of knowledge or knowing. So just because you heard it doesn't mean you learned it, I think is really critical as just another way for us to stay attentive to the ways that social media or knowledge or news or information gets shared. We could even say, what's the difference between information, facts, opinion, belief, vision, imagining, reality? Quickly, if you want to be an epistemologist, I will just say quickly, epistemology will like allow you to unravel everything that you think you know. And the epistemological crisis is just like this with an epistemic crisis, you know? No, that was redundant too. Wow, my brain. oh no, this isn't going well. Let me say that again. An epistemological crisis is like this with an existential crisis. That's what I meant. Okay. Actually, let's just keep going with this thread then. Let's just keep going with the thread because the existential crisis is like this with an emotional psychological crisis. And I want to differentiate that too because there's something very important here. Even though I've been saying there's like all these evaluations, we have to be critical and really thoughtful about how we evaluate certain standards of knowledge and credible knowers and authority and all those things. Um, which is not just to say like the people with the degrees or the positions of power are the ones we should be listening to. That's also to say that there are lots of ways of knowing that have been invalidated for political purposes to sort of move power in the way of the world. I hope you know what I mean. But when I say that, like, okay, epistemological crisis, existential crisis, and an emotional psychological crisis are all so close together, what that is getting at is that we actually have to develop our own capacities to be able to deal with the truth. Now, in an epistemological conversation, it can quickly go to like relativism, where people say, how do we even know? We can't know. Or we could say there's no such thing as objective truth, everything is perception. And I will vehemently say that I still believe in objective truth. I still believe that there is a reality. There is still something that is. And we might know it imperfectly. We might not know it at all. But that doesn't necessarily exclude the fact that there is still something. So it feels like we're being like really serious armchair philosophers right now. But oh well, go with it. Like there are so many things that exist beyond the realm of our capacity to know. And I don't think that we as humans should be so arrogant to assume that what we know is like the condition for reality. It might be the condition for our perception of it, or our perception might be the condition for our knowledge of it. I don't want to get into these weeds. On the other side, there's something important here too about like, just because some people can't access phenomenon or dimensionality or a kind of like texture of reality does not mean it doesn't exist either. So you can see, geez, how dicey this gets. Someone might be like, well, that's your experience. That's not my experience. And since it's not a universal experience, that means no, it's not real. I'm thinking here about people who have access to different ways of knowing or different explanations or even different experiences. So some language that might be put on this, I don't like it, but some language might be like supernatural, paranormal, or a different like perception of reality altogether, extrasensory perception, if you will. That's like a very alien-esque like way of thinking about it, but there are plenty of other knowledges and traditions and ways of knowing that do account for things like spirit and other entities and other energies. So just because some people don't have that sensibility or view, like I'm thinking like really senses, a way of knowing, does not mean necessarily that it doesn't exist or it's not real. So, wow. Epistemic crisis, existential crisis, emotional psychological crisis, and that little rant was about like still having some claims to objective truth and reality. Epistemology ultimately is grounded in reality, and I think when I say truth is a relationship, this is going to be the relationship that we have to reality. I'm working this out right now. This isn't perfect. That's not a clear definition, but like we are literally in the process of developing an epistemology of intimacy, that notion of truth as a relationship. You just got a little nugget of it. Okay. I'm going to keep going on this because when I talk about the reality, then so much of the emotional or psychological crisis that we can experience when it comes to what we know is really about a capacity if we can handle the truth. Now, I'm not one to only talk about doom and gloom and violence and atrocity and heinous acts of just the most depraved things. But when it comes to knowledge and politics and power, those very heinous, atrocious acts and realities have to be reckoned with. I'm speaking right now from a place which a lot of this is being inspired right now as like a real time response to another so called release of these Epstein files, which is so fascinating. Like I'm not going to get into the depths of the Epstein files, but I am wanting to offer some processing around how to think about this because okay, we're going to go. I'm just telling you where we're going. A few weeks ago when I did the heated rivalry thing, I was like, I'm not going to talk about heated rivalry even though it's a great show. And I'm sorry, it feels gross and weird, I know, to like pair heated rivalry with the Epstein files. I'm not making like to like comparisons here. But what I'm trying to illustrate is that the point I was making several weeks ago about heated rivalry, namely about the fandom and the cultural phenomenon of so many people exercising their attention and their energy into curating and sharing this analysis about this show, is what you can see happening in response to releases of these Epstein files. Look, here's where I'm like, I already feel myself wanting to go these disclaimers. Like, they're not really releasing the files. They're not really exposing much of anything if so many elements of it are redacted. And there's this other very important point, which is that whatever is being released right now is like on purpose. Because what we are realizing is that the Epstein files this is a very great, the whole situation is such a profound demonstration of this like very small pulling the curtain back to reveal that the way of the world is actually manipulated and orchestrated by people with immense power and not great intentions, to say the least. We might even say actually horrible, violent, really awful ways of structuring the world. If people are realizing, like, oh my God, this is implicating everybody, billionaires, scientists, politicians, heads of state, celebrities, like all of these people are in these pedophile, billionaire, sexual, violent, child sex trafficking rings, go on and on. I mean, it's just terrible, like truly, truly terrible. And again, I'm not going to spend time there. What I'm trying to point out is that when these files are released, people are like realizing, like, oh my God, the conspiracy theories maybe are right. All of those horrible conspiracy theories about Pizzagate and like cannibalism and eating children, trigger warnings. Sorry, all of this. Heads up. I'm not going to get into the deep, dark stuff of that. So much. But again, oh my God, I can't believe we're doing this. A trigger warning. To say a trigger warning is to say, hey, that is sensitive to the emotional, psychological distress that the realities might actually impose if you are really going to confront it. Man, this just goes so, so deep. Okay, let me stay with the point. My point is that this one right now, even something like this so-called release of these files, we could have a critical perspective on and say, this is also strategic. Like, this is a thoughtful titration of information. We could question the timing, we could question the content and the how and what is actually being revealed. Like, that there's a purpose here. If the people in power are orchestrating all of this, then something like the so-called release would also be orchestrated. That's something I feel like we should be able to really understand. And worse is that there's so much that if what they're revealing is heinous, then there's so much more that they are not revealing that is worse. That can be a difficult thing to swallow, especially when we are, as empathetic, caring, sensitive humans, presumably who have a constitution for responding to like violent, I am reluctant to use the word evil, But these kinds of demonstrations of absolute cruelty, when we are the people who still have a sensibility to be able to respond to such acts of cruelty with the, like, abject disgust, the repulsion, that distress, then it makes sense why we would react to that first level, and be almost psychologically protecting ourselves against recognizing the worst that exists that we don't know about. So in this case of the, like, releasing of the files, it's important for us to maybe rationally first comprehend that what is being exposed cannot be the worst thing that has happened, but far worse is still being covered over. Maybe there's something to say about, like, the rational preparation for this, and maybe that's why I'm leaning so much on epistemology and why it's important for us to understand the way that our knowledge works. Because for me, this gives us tools to be able to understand and move through, like, making sense of the world, especially even the worst things. Now, like I already said, I'm not like a doom and gloom person. I don't want to be focusing on the worst things that are capable of being committed by people in highly intentional, orchestrated, historical ways. But that is the truth of the world. Now, I think that there are this is so hard. Okay, do I go politics? Do I go power? Where do we go from here? I want to say something about Black history, and I will also say, I had a conversation with a friend once a couple years ago, and this was one of those conversations. I talked about, like, moments that mattered, or the kinds of things that we share with each other that really become significant for our understanding. Maybe this is yet another example of, like, an epistemology of intimacy. Truth is a relationship. But I remember distinctly this one conversation I was having with a friend who his whole work is, like, Black history, African American Black history. And he's one of those people where, thank goodness we have folks who find some category of content and learning and information and research, and then they go for it, because I can't be that person. That's not my thing. However, we can learn from each other, which is, again, sort of what I was trying to say with, like, the heated rivalry stuff. Like, find your lane. This is to build political movements, to help build resistance, to help be more in the collective space of, like, truth and liberation. Find your thing, do it well, share it with others. And we need to learn how to be able to trust the expertise and the wisdom and the insight and the knowledge of others. We do it all the time anyway. That's just how it works in the world. But we can be more intentional about how we do this within an explicitly, consciously political landscape where power is implicated. I hope you're following all of this. Let me get back to my story. So I have this friend, and we were talking about how frustrating it is when people cannot really comprehend the, like, darkest aspects of our human history and our political realities. And a lot of that, it's really frustrating when it becomes a sort of willful ignorance where people intentionally look away or put up their walls and say, I can't even look at that. I remember the conversation with him being so poignant and impactful for me because he said, yeah, like, if you were to read and actually study the history of slavery in the United States, the stories of what happened are nothing short of absolutely traumatizing. Those are accounts that once you get them in your brain, they will never leave you. And I get why people don't want to put their attention on that, because that is a terrible feeling, to internalize these horribly violent, absolutely disgusting, completely heinous atrocities. But if we do not account for that, then we cannot actually move in connection to reality. I remember, like, having that conversation with him, and I think it was especially, like, aligned with probably the late 2023, maybe early 2024. And for me, that was very, very important. We were making these connections between like what is new now in terms of technology, internet, social media, the means for how we can actually communicate with each other in a much more, it seems like, I know complications around the nuances of social media, internet, surveillance, tech companies, all being implicated in these larger structures of political power. Yes, yes, yes. Um, but now, particularly with 2023, and the daily live streaming of Israel's genocide of Palestinians, for those who are watching, firsthand account being documented by people in Palestine with their own cell phones recording what was going on. For those who are watching it and bearing witness and not looking away, that to me was a profoundly affecting and absolutely necessary experience to be able to really make sense of the world. People, will talk about like Palestine and Gaza, like really is what is going to help get us all free. And in that way, I recognize that as true. I believe that because it was not and is not, it's not the only genocide and it's not the first genocide, obviously. But what was so remarkable was that we have the most highly documented, live streamed genocide that the world could watch in real time. That was not possible in the times of slavery in the United States or the genocide of Native Americans. And it's even not actively so well documented right now in places like Sudan. So this is not to say that, we privilege, and this is so fucked up to say, but like privilege a genocide of Palestinians over anybody else as like, this is the most important genocide we should care about. But what is significant and substantial about it is the epistemic effect of being able to watch real-time live stream documentation of reality. So what that does is completely pierces through the veil of ignorance that is constructed where, if like myself included, I will say I am a changed, transformed person, always growing, always learning. And when I would and still do to this day see images of people's bodies bleeding in the streets or children dying in violent ways at the hands of militaries that are supported by global networks, so Israel supported by the weaponry and the funding of people like us taxpayers in the United States. When you see these things happening, you have to be affected by it. And I would tell myself every day, let this change you, let this change you. Instead of looking away, instead of wanting to deny what I'm seeing, I would always say, let this change you. This is very much echoing Miriam Kaba's now, hopefully, like very well-known phrase of let this radicalize you. Like, rather than lead you to despair, let this radicalize you rather than lead you to despair. Let this change you and how you move in the world. So what I think we're getting at with these, I don't even know how to describe it, like flashpoints or like ruptures. Maybe that's the best way to talk about it. There are certain ruptures that should shake us out of our ignorance and our stupor, that should shock us into revealing a deeper truth. And unfortunately, these examples that I'm offering are dark, violent, very, very awful truths, but they are the truths of the world. And so when we think about, when I kept wanting to say, I want to go back to Black history. We could say anything right now about the history of the world for the past many hundreds of years, at least, that the things that people find so disturbing, that are disturbing, don't get me wrong, that are some of the most like just egregiously unbelievable things that people are doing. These are things that have been done and are happening and continue to happen right now too, and for hundreds of years. So where I want to go with this, I want to talk about the epistemology of ignorance, and I want to talk about I said last week I was gonna talk about some pages before all of this happened, before I went down deep rabbit holes around the Epstein files and conspiracy theories being presumably confirmed to be actual truth. Um, Before all of that, last week I said I was going to offer a little bit of review of some pages that I made back in 2024 that were specifically intended to give us that grounding in a place of how to navigate the world when things are like chaotic, to be an understatement. As my week has gone on since last week, and so many other things have come up that I've been wanting to talk about, I was like, I don't know if we're going to go page by page write this, but I do want to walk through at least one of them. So for reference, this is the packet of pages. This is 5 pages. I titled it Reflections for Moving Through, and they're messages and reminders for staying grounded as the world changes, and you do too. Hopefully, if we're paying attention to what is happening and we let that change us, then this packet of pages was intended to be something that could help stay grounded as the world is changing and you respond to the revelations and the truths and what is being exposed in a way that helps you move through. So, Reflections for Moving Through, you can get this copy, a PDF of all 5 pages on my there's a link on my website, CoriWong.com, but the download is actually on my Buy Me a Coffee page. And I'm going to be honest with you. I went to some dark places this past week while processing what was coming through with the Epstein files released, this last one of 3.5 million files, which again, not a lot, not even the worst, still absolutely terrible. But I've also been, sitting with the realities of what's still happening in Palestine and what's always happening around the world, and just I don't know. Okay, I'm not gonna get lost in it. Let me stay grounded. Let's go over this page, okay? What I did decide was that I at least want to go through the first page. And I'll do a quick overview so you can kind of get a sense for what is in this packet of reflections for moving through. The first page is about humanizing ourselves with accountability. The other one is always moving with others. It's about being part of a movement. I'm going to stop doing story time right now. The third page is the value and necessity of wisdom, with my phrasing of wisdom is truth with lineage and where we can go to get support for how to understand what's happening. The fourth page is being motivated by freedom. That's the ethics that I try to always hold for myself, which is using your freedom to open up more freedom for others. I've been thinking about that a lot. The only legitimate use of freedom is a freedom that opens up more freedom for others. Any other exercise of freedom is, I think, a violation of freedom. Okay, fifth one. The fifth page is about liberation, what liberation is. It's the goal and the guide for all of our work, and to know that it's possible. But for this week, rather than going through all 5 pages, what I want to do is actually just kind of touch on the first page, this one, humanizing ourselves with accountability, because I feel like this was kind of the introductory page on purpose when I made this back in November of 2024. And the first part of it says, I bear witness to all the ways we harm one another and the planet. We are capable of causing so much pain and suffering. And this is kind of like the major theme. The world could be otherwise, so I can be too. On the other side of this extreme polarity, I acknowledge none of this is necessary. We have agency and responsibility to do things differently. So the way this page is structured is that there's a lot of really terrible stuff that's very bad, pain and suffering. And if we bear witness to it, it's a lot. If we have the emotional, psychological capacity that we develop, which I think is a responsibility of us, to develop the capacity to acknowledge all of that, then we have to take in a lot because it's really bad. And on the other side, we can do otherwise. So that's I don't want us to just dwell in the dark reality and let that feel so overwhelming. This is such an important thing I'm going to say. The point about any kind of theory or any kind of work, why do we care? Why do we care to know? Why do we care to share these things with each other? I've always pulled this from Maria Lugonis and Elizabeth Spellman's essay that I always refer to as well, which is Have We Got a Theory for You? Where they break down certain qualities of what constitutes good theory. And one of the things that I think is so important, probably one of the most important takeaways that I've walked with from that essay, is that good theory should locate us with a sense of responsibility and a way to move forward. So if there's anything that is just saying this is the nature of things and it doesn't enhance or contribute to our sense of freedom and responsibility and agency to move towards the values that we do care about, life affirming, sustainable, free, just, liberated spaces, then we should probably question what we're doing here. In a way, it's like very pragmatic. One of the ways to evaluate what we're doing, the information we're taking in, how we're processing it, and the meaning that we make of it is then what does that lead us to next? And if it doesn't give us a sense of responsibility or the possibility of responding with our own sense of agency to co-create a better world, the world that we would actually want, then we should really pause and reflect on if this is something that is like, what is the purpose of all of this? In my mind, as I hear myself say that, I'm like, there's a little space here that's saying like, yeah, so we could question if there is a strategic, we could say even malevolent operation at play about releasing things like Epstein files in such a like deliberate process where we know that the worst things are not being revealed and the majority of people are still being protected. And there aren't any consequences from this. Well, we might wonder what is going on here. Honestly, I've been sitting with this for a while in this past week of thinking about like just what I said of watching every single day children being murdered in Gaza by Israel and trying my hardest to not ever be desensitized to that. In the past week, I was like, oh man, that would be so fucked up, but I wouldn't put it past anybody to say if we broadcast the genocide of people, including the violent murders of a population of half children, so many of these people being under the age of 5 in Gaza and Palestine. If we see that there is an active, unabated genocide of children in Palestine for years, and I'm just talking in like the past few years, couple of years where this has been live streamed, not the 70 years or many decades before. I thought, oh shit, was that psychological warfare to lessen the response of a global or at least American public, US American public, for the pedophile billionaire elite class who have been ritualistically murdering children? Oh, maybe does it go that deep? So here's a question, right? Like you can see if we start to go thinking about conspiracy theories or puzzling the intentions behind things, the line between conspiracy and critical thinking getting very blurry these days. But I am wondering about that so that I have to remind myself like, well, when we are facing the realities of things, we can never be desensitized. We know that. We've seen it. We've seen Black people being murdered by police. To what? People are desensitized to that? No. So we have to be able to respond with our own fortitude to like stay in touch with our humanity. That's why, back to this page, humanizing ourselves with accountability, to stay human, to stay connected to this. Okay, I'm all over the place. I know I could keep going on that thread, and there's probably a lot more important stuff I should be tracing out on that. But the one thing that I want to highlight some of these things that are coming up on this page. So one quote that I have really leaned on for many years is coming from Simone de Beauvoir's The Ethics of Ambiguity. And I feel like the ethics of ambiguity, I know I talk about this all the time and it like starts to feel redundant. Like, do I ever read anything else? Yes, I do. But I'm also trying to give you sort of these little like footholds that have been the anchors for helping me create the way that I understand the world. And you don't have to understand it my way. There are lots of people who understand in different ways. Great. Truth is a relationship. This is the epistemology of intimacy with me. My way of understanding has been formed by certain people, certain anchors. And so the best that I can give you is the truth of the relationship I have to these concepts and these thinkers and these people. One of those is for sure The Ethics of Ambiguity by Simone de Beauvoir, which again was written, it was like a series of lectures, 1945, end of World War II, the Holocaust of millions of Jews and others by Nazi Germany. And Beauvoir is talking about how important it is, again, to be able to face the realities of such atrocities, to recognize that if we are a world in which it is possible for millions of people to die by Holocaust, or I posted something recently that was like, if we cannot grapple with the fact that centuries of slavery in the United States murdered millions of Africans, even before they got to the land of now the United States of America. But we can't recognize that millions of people died just in crossing the ocean and terrible things, then like we are not facing the truth of our reality. That entire populations have been wiped out from genocide to colonize lands like the ones that we live on. We're not facing the truth of reality. So throughout centuries and present day, one of Simone de Beauvoir's most like powerful quotes says this: "It is in the knowledge of the genuine conditions of our life that we must draw our strength to live and our reason for acting." If there's one thing I've been saying, it's that I am very, very reluctant to just take out a quote of someone's work and take it out of context, because the rest of the work is important. The context is meaningful too. But I feel like this quote, it's a popular one, it's powerful. Audre Lorde even quotes this at the end of The Master's Tools. I've said that so many times before because I want people to understand that when we're talking about how do we navigate the world, so much of it is we have to rely on each other. We have to learn with and from each other. This is the epistemology of of intimacy. This is truth is a relationship. So that Audre Lorde at the end of The Master's Tools, that talk, that essay, quotes exactly this passage from Simone de Beauvoir's Ethics of Ambiguity, I think is only reinforcing that if you want to align yourself with certain thinkers like I do, when I say wisdom is truth with lineage, you trust the people who have come before you who are showing you these connections so that we can make meaning of it. And this is pointing to the responsibility we have in understanding that we have to look at the world. We have got to be able to have the constitution and the emotional psychological capacity, the existential frameworks to be able to deal with the most heinous, atrocious things that happen in real life, in our real world, even right now, not just as historical fact. And it is in the knowledge of the genuine conditions of our life that then we draw our strength to live and our reason for acting. That might seem counterintuitive, because maybe people are thinking, wow, this is horrible. Yeah, it is horrible. And you know what else has been horrible? A lot of things in history. But people have pushed through the most horrific things, the most oppressive, violent conditions, because it becomes the strength to live and the reason for acting. Again, I'm not one to be in doom and gloom, and I'm also not one to do like silver linings. I say that all the time. I'm not trying to just like put a nice glowy light on things. But I do think that if you're struggling to figure out what do we do here, this is the closest I could get, is that like if you ground yourself in a principled value of freedom and responsibility, then you know what you need to be doing. Then suddenly life has meaning now. You have a reason for acting, and you have the strength to do it. to be so motivated, to resist, to fight. Like, that has fire in it. This is why, if you've been paying attention to what I've been saying for the past several weeks, this is what Audre Lorde was also talking about with the uses of the erotic. There's many other examples, many other ways of thinking about this, even in Audre Lorde's work herself with the uses of anger, for instance. Bell Hooks talks about it too, killing rage. There are so many ways we can think about the depth of our feelings when either that is the joy and pleasure of connection, or it is that powerful source of knowing that burns inside of us that motivates our politics too. I believe that's what Audre Lorde's talking about when she talks about the erotic. But that, whatever that is, that deep, strong knowing deep inside of us, becomes what I think we can attach to what Beauvoir is saying here: the strength to live and the reason for acting. Make that be the web that we connect across so many different thinkers, so many different, of our thought leaders' work that inspire us and how we make meaning of it. Even take it on for yourself. What does it mean to know in the depth of your being that there is a reason for acting and you have the strength to live? If we don't have that now, take that on as your assignment. Because the world is. The reality is. And it always has been. Again, right now I know I'm focusing on the bad stuff. There are always beautiful, incredible, and amazing things too. That is also very important. But I am specifically right now wanting to be talking about the epistemological implications of whether or not we are capable and willing to look at the worst things and recognize that as something that can also motivate us for a reason to live. Now, okay, I'm already still wheeling all over the place. But I know that in the past year, in the past couple of years, the ways that I have been processing, bearing witness to horrible realities, violent things, is not to feel disempowered, but instead to recognize that if there is one thing that we can do, even as what might feel like small, tiny individuals against big orchestrated systems of historical consolidated power, then so be it. That's what we do. Our little piece, as fully and as ferociously as committed as possible. I believe that is the way forward. And I believe that there's a lot of power in that. I'm not trying to say it's not going to work. I think it is the way. I think that's the strategy. All the way back to those seemingly trite analogies I was making about heated rivalry in the fandom. Find your thing, do it excellently, and it's together as the collective that when we all contribute with our most fully, that then I believe so many new possibilities will happen. The conditions will change. This whole time I've been sitting here, and I have not revisited my definition of power that I want to highlight, just because I think it's always important. If we think about power as the ability to influence the conditions of our choices, then knowledge is power is an association we can draw to say that when we have knowledge that allows us to know the genuine conditions of our life, and then the ability to influence the conditions of our choices, we have created a sense of knowing about the conditions of our life, which means we have changed even the conditions of our intelligibility, the way that we make sense and meaning of the world, so that we can have now different choices. We can move differently with that kind of knowing. Okay. This was not even where I thought it was going to go today. Anyway, let's see what happens next. Oh, still back on this page, actually. I'm not done here. I didn't want to just highlight that Simone de Beauvoir quote. What I wanted to highlight is something that I'm really questioning right now after my rabbit hole deep dives into Epstein file, conspiracy theories, maybe confirmed realities. Let me tell you why. Here on this side of the page, the first little phrase that I wrote here was, "I do not make monsters out of people." I do not delude myself by dehumanizing those who act in cruel or unjust ways. There are no excuses or exceptions. As humans, we are fully capable of destroying ourselves and each other. They are human. I am human too. The desire to distance myself from the ugly truths of what people do is an attempt to look away, to hide from reality, seek comfort in surprise, you might say shock, by staying mystified. Can I see myself in them even when I don't want to? Truth is a requirement for any kind of accountability. I know what I was getting at here. I was thinking that there are ways, and our language reflects this, but there are ways that we say it's not possible for a human to do these things to children, for instance. Or we can say it is truly diabolical, meaning conjuring the devil here. It is evil, diabolical, demonic for people to do such violent, systematic, repeated acts on purpose to humans, and then we take it and say the most vulnerable among us, children. So we call these people monsters. We say they have to be just demons, not humans. And when I wrote this in 2024, I was really sitting with this fact of like, no, what the ethics of ambiguity shows us is that the greatest forms of human destruction and violence are actually executed by humans themselves. So in this way, no, we can't let people off the hook. They are human people doing horribly violent things to others. A person pushes the button to detonate the nuclear bomb and wipe out hundreds of thousands of people in an instant. A person does, I'm not going to go into the details, but like whether it's at the level of some sort of like secret cult cabal or in your own home, in your own family with abuse, people are harming each other. We are humans capable of horrible things. And I think it is a weak attempt to try to escape and distance ourselves from the people who will commit genocide. Or we would say kidnap and disappear families from the streets or their workplaces or schools. I don't think it does us any service to try to call these people monsters or otherwise separate ourselves and dehumanize them instead of recognizing it is a very human capacity for us to do these things. Just as it is very human and within our own human capacity to do the opposite. The world could be otherwise, and I could be too. The world could be otherwise where we could actually care for and protect each other and nourish each other. We could create systems and like global systems where what we do is actually life affirming for all living things, not just for humans. I believe we could do that. This is also a reason why in my classes many, 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 many years ago, I banned the phrase. I said students are not allowed to acknowledge certain things like oppressive realities and just brush it off as human nature. I said human nature is not allowed in this class. Now, it might sound contradictory when I'm saying that, but the reason why is because too many people use it as an excuse to be like, well, it's just human nature for us to do these things. And I feel like that is lazy. I feel like that gives a pass to say it's almost inevitable and natural. It's like, don't call them demons and monsters. Recognize that they're humans, but don't reduce it down to human nature as if we have no other choice or option. So those are like two sides of the same coin. We try to separate or we try to conflate. And both of those things remove us from the space of having human agency and our own freedom to do otherwise. Now, I think that's important. I don't know. I'm trying to sit with it because, like I said earlier, I also don't want to assume or impose that there cannot be other forms of energy, spirit, or entity, like I said in the very beginning. So all of this is sort of like maybe agnostic in a way, and we can evaluate it based on the implications or the opportunities of what it sets forth for us to be able to do in light of how we think. But given that so much around the Epstein files, for instance, is this like notion of demons and ritualistic like worshiping of the devil. I don't know. I'm not trying to, this is going to sound wild. I'm not trying to say that it can't be that, and I'm also not trying to say that it is. So bear with me here. But um one thing as I've been thinking, like, how do I talk about this now? Because people are saying there's like satanic rituals, and they're like, are they vampires? are there are there these other kinds of like entities that are taking people's souls and making them do these things? Maybe at this point, here's the thing: I'm not going to dismiss that as not a possibility. But I can also say, like, I don't believe that I have been taken over by demons. So it's not to say we're all in this. That gives me hope. Or it's not to say that we can't. Even if we were to go so far as to actually say, well, humans are capable of terrible things, but there are also monsters among us, like non-human monsters doing horrible things that have power, and they're exercising that over everything and shaping our whole reality. If you want to go that route, okay, but you are still human. And we as humans can still do something very human together. I believe that. That's what I'm trying to say. I don't want to like get to this place where no matter which account we offer, it somehow eliminates our possibilities for responsibility and agency and freedom to stay aligned with our vision for what we want to do and give us a path forward for how we can choose and act right now. Um, that is a little bit different from where I was going here, this page in 2024, when I was like, let's not dehumanize. Let's stay very, very human and know that we can do this. The best of us is also already present within us, even if our human capacity to do the worst imaginable things are also present and demonstrated on a regular basis. Um, I wanted to say it's not superhuman to do what is right and just in the world. So we don't have to be more than human. We can be very human and do what is just and right in the world in the realm of our own possibilities every day. I wrote, I have the inherent capacity to act, to choose, to show up and create more freedom for myself and others. And I see others who do so too on a regular basis. I intentionally align myself with purpose and responsibility, even when this takes practice, and recognizing that I could do otherwise, I still choose to move with love. Again, if you want this page or the other ones, please have it. I make this free on purpose. These are 5 very condensed, but hopefully very supportive ways for just, like I said initially, reminders for staying grounded as the world changes, and you do too. But now, what I want to do is share a little bit more on this, like potentially, more. I don't know. I don't even know how to say this. Let's call it spiritual, if you will, spiritual realm. Because what I'm touching on here and we're kind of flirting with is this realm that goes beyond a kind of positivist, material, objective reality, which we should be critical of, I think, and opens up to the possibility of something much more spiritual happening, whether that is in the form of like demonic figures and energies or positive ways of conjuring spirit with power and like the goodness in the world. Just for the sake of referencing, because I like to share at this point some of what I'm doing with these weekly updates is trying to document and share the process that I'm literally going through week by week so that you can maybe join in or be in the relationship with me. The truth is a relationship of this epistemology of intimacy. If you want to move through or just know how I'm moving, then part of it is sharing some of these like anchors that I was talking about. This week, I've been moving through or making progress through a new book called The Conjuring of America by Lindsay Stewart. And I'm loving it. I'm loving it because it's a really beautiful account of, like, Black women from slavery exercising conjure, which some might call magic or other kinds of traditions that are like it's a spiritual practice of healing, of knowing, of understanding certain properties of plants and ways to like take care of people that of course get exploited through the like economic and political oppressive systems of slavery and capitalism and white supremacy. But going through the Conjuring of America right now simultaneously is really beautiful because it's just one more example of local knowledge and sort of the ways that local knowledges are grounded in the land and plants and cultures develop from a different way of knowing. And so Conjure explicitly has this element of sort of like spiritual, fantastic, extra reality, extra material reality at play that influences how things go. And just for fun, like I am also thinking about this too in terms of the epistemology of intimacy and relationship. I know Lindsay Stewart, we met so many decades ago and ended up going to the same graduate program. We went to Penn State together. And we weren't super close, but I remember her being really into Toni Morrison and Zora Neale Hurston and wanting to write in a different kind of way. And it's just incredible to see the impact of her work as she's producing it. And so if you're interested in something that can kind of present a glance into Black history in the United States, The Conjuring of America is a really good one that gives this sort of historical genealogical account of where very common, everyday, well-known staples in American culture come from and how that is rooted in Black women's magic, if you will, that then has been completely severed from that history and we don't know it. So I want to do a plug for that because I'm just that it's a book that's I'm like it's moving with me right now. And it's not the only example of that, but of this kind of like cultural erasure or separation from the people who really knew the plants and the bodies and the people who were in relationship with a kind of knowledge to make it useful for the benefit of people, and then how that got exploited, extracted, or colonized, and then commodified to make money for people in ways that are like very much a degradation of the even just at the level that like it's worse than this, obviously, but even at the level of eliminating the credibility and the authority of certain knowers as healers or like, you know, having a way of understanding the world and how to be with people in their bodies. It's just a different form of understanding reality. You could talk about indigenous ways of knowing as a form of local knowledge. There's cultural traditions, all of this stuff. And like Western medicine is basically always trying to co-opt certain things that have been known for centuries by people and practiced in their traditions, all of this. So that was going to be a little segue that I wanted to get into to like try to present a little bit more of what I think is helpful here in the overall framework of what I wanted to talk about today, which is the epistemology of ignorance and situating that a little bit more with what I want to be doing here with the epistemology of intimacy. I know I've already been going for an hour, so I'm like trying to like make sure I'm getting where I want to go. Um, but I think that this is a really good opportunity to introduce a little bit more about the epistemology of ignorance as we're talking about things coming to light. As we're supposed to be acknowledging Black history in the United States, which is nothing but like an attempt to counteract the covering over of so much reality and experience in history, a perpetuation of an epistemology of ignorance. So I'm just trying to give some frameworks. I want to give some conceptual tools to help understand what all this is. And for my project's purposes, it is also helpful to know that the epistemology of ignorance is sort of the, I guess, inspiration of an epistemology of intimacy, because I, having grown up with the epistemology of ignorance being like pretty much the watershed moment in my philosophical projects when I was 20, um, to now be working on the epistemology of intimacy, that is sort of my attempt at like, what do we do with all of this? So, in the most simple, plain terms, I'll tell you, if we understand the epistemology of ignorance and its function for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and I keep saying that, like, well, we should know what to do with all of that. I am trying to develop the epistemology of intimacy as a sort of antidote or a counter to what is the reality and the operation of the epistemology of ignorance. Okay, this is not going to be comprehensive. It can't be. But I want to give a cursory introduction in case you're not familiar with the epistemology of ignorance. I've done YouTube videos of this way back in the day, maybe like 2011-ish. So well over a decade ago. I was young and I've grown and learned a lot, but it still is out there on YouTube. And I've written about this in other places and I've talked about it. And I would, at some point, I guess I'm probably not going to do this now, but at some point, I would love to tell the story of Charles Mills, who is the person who wrote The Racial Contract. And this is the book that introduces the concept of an epistemology of ignorance using that frame, that coinage of the term. And I would love to tell the story about Charles, because if truth is a relationship and this is about epistemology of intimacy, then Charles is a real person in my life. And I have these specific moments that mattered with him that actually shaped so much of my own path. And I think that that's so important. Like, over the past couple of years, as I've been developing a lot of content and sharing it in some spaces in particular, I've been working with some youth in town through one of our nonprofits, the Cultural Enrichment Center, which is specifically for Black and African American youth. For a couple of years now, every year I've done a program with them. And the program last year was called How We Know Who We Are. And I feel like those outlets with them are kind of the like little bubbling brook of inspiration that like motivates more of my work is in other places throughout the year. So anyway, How We Know Who We Are is helpful. And last year, when we were talking about the importance of self-definition, particularly in the frame of Blackness, and tracing through the work of artists and poets and like revolutionary activists, movement leaders, one of the things that came through was that when you're talking about James Baldwin, Malcolm X, MLK, Lorraine Hansberry, Nina Simone, all these different people, they knew each other. That was like, the students were like, wait a minute, these are just people. And they're like, they actually know each other. These are real relationships. And this is something that I like have really sat with for so long in my own, like, I remember when I was 20 and I went to my first philosophical conference and I was like, these are the people who write these books. Like, they're real people. Talk about humanizing, right? To know that what we are really learning, the things that can change us, that can shape our understandings of reality and give us new foundational concepts or perspectives to move differently in the world, that's coming from people who are real people, and we can have real relationships with them or know them, even if it's not person to person in the blood and the flesh. Like, I don't know Bell Hooks, never met Bell Hooks, but that Bell Hooks is a real person who knew other people. Duh, obviously. And on an epistemological level, truth is a relationship. The epistemology of intimacy, we learn from each other, and that gets reflected in the work that we do. So such that Audre Lorde can quote Simone de Beauvoir. You know what I mean? You getting this? Okay, so here's the thing. Here. With Charles Mills, I'm not going to get into it today, but I have my own stories with Charles that I would love to share at some point to indicate like the human being and how his presence in my life even shaped my own journey. And I have something in my eye. This is really timely. Cute. Okay. Key thing from the epistemology of ignorance that I want to talk about is that basically the concept is to say that our entire ways of knowing, entire epistemologies, can actually be produced as ignorance. You hear me? This is a way to say, like, everything that you've been taught is not what it seems. Or everything that you have been taught is not actually a reflection of reality. Or everything that we have been taught is actually part of a larger production of ignorance. So that all these different funnels of teaching, media, literature, science, even, it's going to get a little conspiratorial sounding. I know. But the epistemology of ignorance is to say that there are actually so many mechanisms that produce an entire way of knowing that is actually not a honest reflection of reality, but instead this, like, you could call it like a mystified bubble of ignorance. Actually, the way that Charles Mills talks about it is it's an inverted epistemology. So rather than reflecting reality, what you actually get is an inverted view of reality. This is fascinating because let's tie it into what has been released again with the Epstein files right now. What I think is so remarkable and like kind of incredible is that all of the conspiracy theories from like the early 2000s and years after that we're talking about Pizzagate and like the QAnon that came from that, of there being these child sex trafficking rings, they're eating children, they're shipping them in these Wayfair containers, and the billionaire celebrity elites are the ones who are like doing all these horrible things. That's weird because it's actually acknowledging maybe the truth, but the inversion of it is a true narcissistic inversion, which is to say, but those people are the ones doing it, not the person who actually is like pointing the finger. That might be a little bit of a messy example, but the way to say this is that like an inverted epistemology or an epistemology of ignorance is one that is constructed to prevent self-transparency, to prevent the literal reflexivity that I was talking about when I first started here. It is to try to avoid at all costs an actual reflexive looking in the mirror, and instead producing so much ignorance that it now becomes like almost impenetrable, that we cannot even fathom reality, even though it's happening right in front of us. It's almost like uh it, like what you think you're seeing gets somehow mirrored in a way that now people say, oh yes, I see what I'm seeing, and they literally think the opposite of what is real. That sounds so abstract, but I'm like, I've talked about Naomi Klein's mirror world before. Sorry, the book is The Doppelganger. Doppelganger is Naomi Klein's recent book, Doppelganger, talks about the mirror world. And I've said this before in other lives. Like, you could talk about it as like the upside down, the sunken place, all these kinds of things. And there's a lot of language that people have used to talk about this like mystification, but there's a particular epistemic strategy of flipping things just enough that it's actually almost real. It's almost right, but it's inverted as this way of protecting, like, so that we cannot actually be pointing at the real thing. It's this projection of a deflection that is so dangerous because that becomes this like inverted logic where now you can't even talk to each other. Okay. I do want to talk a little bit about this by giving you this is like, read the whole book. Don't take the quote out of context. But one of my favorite things is always page 18 and 19 in this book, the racial contract. And Charles Mills is saying, there's this racial contract. We've heard about the social contract, but there's actually a racial contract. And we'll call that global white supremacy. And so the people who sign off on global white supremacy then become beneficiaries of this entire system that has basically ruled the world for, at this point, 400 years plus. Okay. That sounds like a conspiracy. I know, except when it is actually how things operate. So why do we not know that? Well, there's this entire whole orchestration of producing ignorance so that people would not know certain things. God, I could go off on this forever because the epistemology of ignorance is so important. But here, let me just read a little bit of what Charles Mills is talking about so you have it. Page 18. But for the racial contract, things are necessarily more complicated. The requirements of objective cognition, factual and moral, in a racial polity are in a sense more demanding, and the officially sanctioned reality is divergent from actual reality, the officially sanctioned reality by the contract. So here it could be said, one has an agreement to misinterpret the world. One has to learn to see the world wrongly, but with the assurance that the set of mistaken perceptions will be validated by white epistemic authority, whether religious or secular. So thus, in effect, on matters related to race, the racial contract prescribes for its signatories an inverted epistemology, an epistemology of ignorance, a particular pattern of localized and global cognitive dysfunctions, which are psychologically and socially functional, producing the ironic outcome that whites will in general be unable to understand the world they themselves have made. He goes on to describe that this is partly like the signing is like to be achieving whiteness. I call that a person of whiteness. To become this is like a kind of rite of passage where you now assume this cognitive model that precludes self-transparency and genuine understanding of social realities. To a significant extent, then, white signatories will live in an inverted delusional world, a racial fantasy land, a consensual hallucination. To quote William Gibson's famous characterizations of cyberspace, through this particular hallucination, though this particular hallucination is located in real space, there will be white mythologies, invented Orients, invented Africas, invented Americas, all of these things. Countries that never were, inhabited by people who never were, but who attain a virtual reality through their existence in travelers' tales, folk myth, all this kind of stuff. Hollywood cinema, even scholarly theory, even colonial reports. Living in the white imagination determinedly imposed on their alarmed real-life counterparts. Okay, this will be the last thing I read. One could say, then, as a general rule, that white misunderstanding, misrepresentation, evasion, and self-deception on matters related to race are among the most pervasive mental phenomena of the past few hundred years, a cognitive and moral economy psychically required for conquest, colonization, and enslavement. And these phenomena are in no way accidental, but prescribed by the terms of the racial contract, which requires a certain schedule of structured blindnesses and opacities in order to establish and maintain the white polity. Okay, this would be, if you want to try to find the connections, this is real. I think the racial contract is real. The rest of the book is nothing but historical accounts and basically giving 100 pages more of argumentation to prove that point. Brilliant book, brilliant structure. I don't question it at all because it's real. But if you want to say okay, how does that work? It works in the same way that a conspiracy theory would suggest that a elite of billionaires class all agree to mum's the word, not say anything, and yet they participate in the covering over and the hiding of what is actually happening. Okay, that I don't even like talking about these Epstein files and all of this because it almost in a way sensationalizes what is actually true historical fact, that things get covered over. We have epistemologies of ignorance built out to prevent us from being able to really grapple with the reality of things. I want to take a moment here to say that whether it's the history of how colonization works and has established what we know to be, for instance, the United States today, through slavery and genocide, through capitalism and exploitation, we could point to so many different examples of how our reality is functioning, but we are not taught the actual history. And one of the key phrases, God, this thing in my eye is killing me. One of the key phrases that Charles Mills talks about is that it's psychologically and socially functional to have this sort of cognitive inversion. Presumably because if people were to actually see it, maybe they would want to stop it, they wouldn't want to participate. Or at this point, I'm even willing to say maybe it's psychologically and socially functional because if people were to really see the atrocities that are at play, that have created the world as it is for hundreds of years still at present, people would collapse because they don't have the emotional constitution to handle that kind of trauma. Yeah, I could agree with that too. But one thing that Charles Mills died in 2021. And so when 2023 happened and I'm watching now every single day live stream genocide on my phone and like it's happening in real time. This isn't like uncovering just the historical atrocities. This is like we are literally watching it happen in real time. And I was like, how are people not responding to this? How are people not caring about this? How does this not destroy everything that we're doing? People are saying that now. Like, pick your crisis, pick your disaster. The fact that it doesn't like cause massive uprising and upheaval among so many of us. What are we doing? What are we doing? Well, I started to realize it was like, okay, when it's happening every single day, we see documentation live streamed, whether that's like what's happening in Minnesota on the streets now in the United States and elsewhere, or it's happening in Gaza, or it's happening in the Congo or Sudan or Haiti, or it's happening in any other place. But if we are literally seeing it and we're not doing anything, what is that? Because that's not a production of ignorance. That is the revelation of truth to apathy, denial. And I wanted to sit with Charles and be like, I believe the epistemology of ignorance. It has changed my life to understand that as a framework for how to make meaning in the world, how to understand what's really going on. The epistemology of ignorance as a concept made sense of pretty much everything for me. Until I had to confront the fact that willful ignorance in real time doesn't make as much sense, because the best I could come up with years ago was like denial, that like you're confronted, it's right here in your face, and you just go, no, it's not. That's denial. Maybe. I think we're even beyond that at this point. I think we're beyond denial to the point where people, maybe this is like the desensitization question, where people are like accommodating it, accepting it, whatever it is. It's not an upheaval. It's not a mass resistance. I don't know. Anyway, I wish I could talk to Charles Mills right now and say the epistemology of ignorance for hundreds of years, yes, made it a lack of self-transparency, a sort of inverted cognitive dysfunction, so that people are not seeing what is really literally right in front of them that they themselves have made. However, now with social media, with all these kinds of like opportunities for us to watch in real time, it is in our faces. That's different from a lack of self-transparency. That is I don't even know. I don't even know exactly how to say it. I've been trying to come up with words. I feel like I got some, but it's eluding me at the moment. The best I could come up with years ago was denial, and that's not even happening, because it's not the denial of it happening. It's a totally different reaction to it, which is bordering on, maybe it's the part that I like banned in my class of being like, yeah, it happens. Human nature. Is it the flattening of reality? I don't know. Now I'm just musing. So I'm gonna stop doing this like philosophical reflection in real time. Though it is part of the process. You can see it happening. Anyway. Yeah, I think that the epistemology of ignorance, I don't know. I don't know how to make sense of what people are responding to at this moment. Anyway, let me take that. Instead of continuing going on, we could do a whole book reading of The Racial Contract, which I highly recommend if you want to. And do what I was saying weeks ago, which was like, take it, run with it, learn it, get your analysis on, share what you learn with others, make meaning, find something interesting, like, oh my God, did you see this? Always, always, always connect, always make the connections. That's the thing. I had a stronger, much more like vigorous statement that I wanted to make about like how to do this, which was to always connect. At this point, whether it's conspiracy theory or whether it's analysis, even in imperfect conditions of social media run by tech bros who have ultimate control over literally everything, even in that space, I think that it's important for us to still have the energy to connect and share. That's like the epistemology of intimacy. Truth is a relationship. We have to be connecting with each other. So right now, it's not the same lovely experience of being so enthusiastic over heated rivalry. But there is this response that if you go down the certain rabbit holes and you look into it, people aren't generating content with analysis, finding records and making connections with names and the histories and like cross international relationships that are like uncovering pretty suspect and pretty sketchy things that like otherwise would be covered over if people weren't doing that like kind of sleuthing work. So all I'm gonna say is like this is what we need to do. If you want to go beyond the analysis of uncovering the truth of things like major networks of evil, the option I will offer is that like this is also what we need to do to save each other, to share what we learn, to make the connections, to help us make meaning in a way that creates an understanding of the world that gives us back our responsibility and our agency and the will to live, the strength to live, and our reasons for acting, just as Beauvoir had said. I wanted to share one more thing is just kind of like we're gonna lighten up a little bit for the sake of another demonstration of the epistemology of ignorance and um this is a personal truth anecdote from my week. Bear with me if this feels like a really rough pivot, kind of last minute. But here's an example of an epistemology of ignorance at work and why it's important for us to share, and also a little bit more about truth as a relationship, all of these layers stacked onto each other at once. So, in addition to The Conjuring of America, another little input that I had this week was a documentary called Regarding Susan Sontag. I've been watching a lot of documentaries lately about people. And Susan Sontag was someone who was like, I know the name, but I do not know the person. I do not know the work, which is wild. How do I not know Susan Sontag's work? Do you? No. But that's kind of the case with like a lot of people who were vocal against war or against racial injustice. Like what do we not know about Assata Shakur? How come we're not taught these things? Those are the questions we should be asking to really try to like shave off some of the epistemology of ignorance that we are just taught to not know. So anyway, I watched this documentary called Regarding Susan Sontag, and I was fascinated from a personal standpoint, like very intrigued in her story and her work, and always like sort of baffled by like, how do I not know this person's work? Such an interesting question. But in it, I took a million notes, like you can see, just for show and tell. It's like, this is how I watch a documentary about Susan Sontag. What? Okay. But I wanted to name one thing, a quote that she had that I really appreciated. That for me kind of connects back to what I'm trying to get at when I say truth is a relationship. And this quote I wrote from the film is when Sontag says, "The truth is always something told, not something that is known. If there were no speaking or writing, there would be no truth about anything. There would only be what is." So the truth is always something told, not something that is known. If there were no speaking or writing, there would be no truth about anything. There would only be what is. For me, I think why this caught my attention is that I'm trying to put my finger on exactly how to articulate truth as a relationship. That the only way for us to have an experience of truth is to share it in whatever means it is. So whether that's trying to pull the cover off of long-standing violence that basically operates like a secret cult network. There have been people who have been trying to share that for a long time, but maybe felt like they couldn't do it so overtly, so they do it like subtly. Or there are even opportunities where we're like, let me share with you explicitly what I am learning. And we learn that from each other. There's something about speaking or writing or sharing that is necessary. And I talked about this as like a major highlight for the Audre Lorde bit on the use of the erotic, that the need for sharing is a human need. And the erotic really only comes through an act of sharing. Like we can get in touch with it, but the power of it comes from sharing. So if truth is a relationship and truth is in some sort of association with reality, so we have knowledge of it, then knowledge is power. There's something here. There's just something here. I don't know. And I really like that because in the time when we're like, what do we do about all of this? When the world is confusing, when the world is not what you've been taught, or the more that we uncover and reveal, the more daunting and complicated the structures might be. I want us to be able to have an anecdote to all of this ignorance that has been produced to keep us mystified and in the dark about the realities of what is true. And exercise some form of an epistemology of intimacy, which puts us in relationship to each other so that we can connect and share some element of truth. Because if it's not something that we share, that is just something that is. I like how Susan Sontag said it's not something that is known, it has to be something that is shared. Because if it's just known in us, then it doesn't do anything. Or even if it's just out there and some people know it, we need to build the world where our epistemologies, our ways of knowing, are actually based on us doing that for each other, sharing that with each other. That was not very eloquent at all. I wish I could be more articulate. I think at this point I'm reaching my end. This is a long one, and I didn't even touch on everything that I thought I would, which is okay. But yeah, the takeaways. If you want to journey in some of this, okay. You know, Charles Mills, The Racial Contract, once again, always and forever, a true love, and really the fundamental. The epistemology of ignorancy is the concept that shaped my whole life. I already talked about David Dean and the questions, the metaphilosophical questions that inspired me to become a philosopher and understand the importance of reflexivity so that we stay critical instead of dogmatic in the ways that we know. And now also The Conjuring of America by Lindsay Stewart is great if you're interested in Black history and wanting to acknowledge at least one wonderful resource that I am currently in the midst of finishing myself. And then another interesting example of coming to understand the work of somebody else was Susan Sontag. Regarding Susan Sontag, it was just an interesting biography that I happened to watch the documentary of this week, among many. Okay, was there more that I wanted to say? I'm sure. Did I have it in note form? Not well. So is this imperfect? Always. I said it was going to be. And then finally, yeah, if you want to get this page or this packet of pages, reflections for moving through, the messages and reminders to stay grounded as the world changes and you do too, you can get it for free as a download on my website, on my Buy Me a Coffee page. I am going to end that there. And in fact, I'm not even going to make promises for next week because I said I was going to do something this week and then the world happened. So I thought about a lot of other stuff and wanted to come in and share that with you. At this point, week to week, hopefully you're finding the connections. That's really all I'm trying to do here is be in the process. You're processing the process with me if you want to. And I don't know what happens next, but that's our job to figure out. Okay, I'm going to end it with that. Thank you so much. If you want to support my work, you can visit CoriWong.com. Love an Artist page has lots of ways to support, including little coffee tips through my Buy Me a Coffee page. And then you know what? Share it. Share stuff. Get these pages, go over it, share it with friends. Truth is something that we have to share. Make the connections. Keep talking about it with everybody. Keep talking about everything with everybody. And as you learn, ask questions, learn from each other. Share. Always connect. Connect with each other. Connect the dots. Truth is a relationship. This is the only way out of what is intentionally confusing. Okay. See you next week. Be well. Take good care of each other. Bye.